Trade Secrets. Chapter 1. The Exchange. Zurich was cold that morning. The streets were clean, the sky was pale, and the lake near the city center reflected the soft light of early autumn. Daniel Hart walked slowly from his hotel to a small café near the conference hall. He wore a dark coat and carried a black leather briefcase. Inside the briefcase were printed documents, charts, and notes for his presentation. Daniel was a financial analyst from New York. He had worked in banking for many years and now gave talks at international events. He was calm, focused, and used to routine. He liked order and didn't enjoy surprises. Sophie Lemaire also walked through the same street that morning. She had lived in Zurich for 3 years, working as a translator for a legal firm that handled international contracts. She was originally from Lyon, France, and spoke 4 languages fluently. Sophie was smart, careful, and quiet. She didn't like attention, but she was good at her job. That day, she had a meeting with a client and carried her own black briefcase. It looked almost the same as Daniel's. Inside were legal papers, signed agreements, and a cassette tape with a recorded conversation in French. She didn't know the full content of the tape, but her boss had told her it was confidential. Both entered the café around the same time. It was a popular place for professionals, with small tables, fresh coffee, and soft music. Daniel chose a seat near the window. Sophie sat 2 tables away. They didn't notice each other. Each placed their briefcase beside their chair. They ordered coffee, checked their watches, and read the morning newspaper. The cafe was busy, and the staff moved quickly. After 20 minutes, Daniel stood up and grabbed the briefcase next to him. Sophie did the same. They left the cafe and walked in opposite directions. Neither noticed the mistake. The briefcases were the same color, same size, and same brand. The only difference was inside. Daniel returned to his hotel and placed the briefcase on the desk. He took off his coat, made a cup of tea, and opened the bag to review his notes. But instead of his documents, he found papers written in French, a map of Europe, and a cassette tape with no label. He stopped and looked again. The papers had names he didn't recognize. The map had red marks on several cities. The tape was old and dusty. Daniel felt confused. He checked the outside of the briefcase. It looked like his, but it wasn't. At the same time, Sophie arrived at her office. She greeted her coworkers and went to her desk. She opened the briefcase to prepare for her meeting. But inside, she found spreadsheets, financial reports, and a folder marked private. The papers were in English and had company logos she didn't know. She looked around the office, wondering if someone had switched her bag. But no one had touched it. She checked the cafe's phone number and called, but the staff said they hadn't seen anything unusual. Daniel sat in his hotel room, holding the cassette tape. He didn't know what to do. He didn't want to listen to something that wasn't his. But his curiosity was strong. He placed the tape in a small player and pressed play. The voices were serious. They spoke about something called Project Helix. They mentioned dates, locations, and names. Daniel didn't understand everything, but he felt something was wrong. The tone was secretive. The words were careful. He stopped the tape and sat in silence. Sophie looked through the financial reports. She didn't understand all the numbers, but she saw patterns. The folder marked private had notes about meetings, transfers, and phone calls. She felt nervous. These papers were not meant for her. She didn't know who Daniel was, but she knew she had something important. Something that could cause trouble. Both Daniel and Sophie had made a simple mistake. But that mistake had opened a door. A quiet exchange in a busy cafe had started something dangerous. They didn't know each other. They didn't know what was coming. But the briefcases they carried now held secrets. Secrets that were never meant to be shared. Secrets that would change everything. Chapter 2. The chase begins. The morning air in Zurich was cool and quiet. Sophie Lemaire walked quickly through the narrow streets, her eyes scanning every face. She returned to the cafe where she had been the day before. She hoped to find the man who had taken her briefcase. She didn't know his name, but she remembered his face. He had sat near the window, dressed in a dark coat, with a calm and serious look. Sophie felt nervous but focused. She knew the documents inside the briefcase were important. She didn't understand everything, but she felt something was wrong. Daniel Hart also returned to the cafe. He had spent the night thinking about the cassette tape and the strange papers. He didn't sleep well. The voices on the tape had spoken about something called Project Helix. The tone was cold and secretive. Daniel didn't know what it meant, but he felt it was dangerous. He wanted to find the woman who had taken his briefcase. He hoped she would be here. They saw each other near the entrance. Their eyes met, and they both understood the mistake. But before they could speak, two men in suits appeared near Daniel. They looked serious and moved with purpose. Daniel felt a sudden fear. He turned and walked away quickly. Sophie saw the men too and followed Daniel without hesitation. She didn't know what was happening, but she trusted her instincts. They moved through the busy street, passing shops and small restaurants. Daniel turned into a side alley, and Sophie stayed close behind. The men followed for a moment, then disappeared into the crowd. Daniel and Sophie entered a small bookstore. It was quiet inside, with shelves full of old books and soft music playing in the background. They walked to the back of the store and stopped. Daniel explained what he had heard on the tape. He described the voices, the words, and the strange feeling he had. Sophie listened carefully. She told him that the documents in the briefcase were from a company involved in international trade. She had translated some of the contracts, but she didn't know the full story. She had seen the name, Helix, before, but only in passing. Now it felt more serious. They decided to meet later and exchange the briefcases. They needed time to think and to understand what they had found. They agreed to be careful and not to speak to anyone else. Daniel returned to his hotel, and Sophie went back to her office. But things were not the same. When Sophie entered her office, she noticed something strange. Her desk was not as she had left it. Papers were moved, and her drawer was open. Nothing was missing. But someone had searched through her things. She felt a chill. She looked around, but no one seemed different. She sat down and tried to stay calm. Daniel arrived at his hotel and found his room disturbed. His suitcase was open, and his papers were spread across the bed. The cassette tape was still there, but it had been moved. He checked the door. It was locked, but someone had entered. He didn't call the police. He didn't know who to trust. Both Sophie and Daniel now understood the truth. Someone was watching them. Someone knew about the briefcases. They didn't know who it was or what they wanted. But they knew the danger was real. The documents were not just business papers. The tape was not just a recording. The briefcases held secrets. Secrets that powerful people wanted to keep hidden. Sophie sat in her office, thinking about the contracts and the strange names. Daniel sat in his hotel room, listening to the tape again. They were strangers, but now they were connected. They had made a mistake, but that mistake had opened a door. A door to something dark and hidden. They didn't know what would happen next. But they knew they had to be careful. They had to move with quiet steps and clear minds. The chase had begun, and there was no turning back. Chapter 3. The Hidden Code. Daniel Hart sat at the small desk in his hotel room. The curtains were closed, and the light from the desk lamp made the papers look older than they were. He had spread out the financial reports from the briefcase. At first, they looked normal: tables, numbers, and company names. But as he read more carefully, he noticed strange patterns. Some numbers repeated in unusual ways. Some transactions were marked with symbols instead of names. There were dates that didn't match any known market events. Daniel had worked in finance for years, and he knew when something didn't make sense. He circled the patterns with a pen and made notes in the margins. The reports mentioned companies in Switzerland, Germany, and Singapore. The money moved between them in fast, quiet steps. There were no clear reasons for the transfers. No products, no services. Just numbers. Daniel felt a chill. He knew this was not normal business. It was something hidden, something designed to stay invisible. At the same time, Sophie Lemaire sat in her apartment with the French documents. She had translated many contracts before, but these were different. The language was vague, and the names were shortened. There were references to offshore accounts in places like the Cayman Islands and Panama. Some pages had handwritten notes in the corners. One note said, "Helix confirmed," next to a list of dates. Another note mentioned, "versus S," with a question mark. Sophie didn't know what it meant, but she felt it was important. She listened to the cassette tape again. The voices were calm but serious. They spoke about meetings, shipments, and numbers. They mentioned Zurich, Hong Kong, and Marseille. The word, helix, came up several times. It was never explained, but it was clearly important. Sophie wrote down every word she could understand. She matched the dates from the tape with the ones in the documents. Slowly, a picture began to form. Daniel and Sophie met in a quiet park near the lake. They sat on a bench and shared their findings. Daniel showed the patterns in the financial reports. Sophie showed the notes and translations. Together, they realized the documents described illegal deals between companies in Europe and Asia. Money was being moved through secret channels. The system was designed to avoid taxes, laws, and attention. Project Helix was not a product or a plan. It was a code name for the system itself. They found one name that appeared in both sets of documents: Victor Stein. He was listed as a consultant in the financial reports and as a client in the translated contracts. Daniel remembered seeing him at the conference. He had given a short speech about global markets. He had looked confident and smooth. Sophie said her firm had translated contracts for one of his companies. She didn't meet him directly, but she had seen his name many times. They searched for more information about Victor Stein. He was a businessman with ties to several firms in Europe and Asia. He had worked in banking, shipping, and real estate. His companies moved money across borders quickly and quietly. He was known for being smart and private. Daniel found an article that called him the Invisible Man of Finance. Sophie found a report that said he had been investigated once, but nothing was proven. They decided to find him, not to confront him, but to understand what he was doing. They wanted to know how deep the system went, but they had to be careful. Victor was powerful, and the people around him were dangerous. They didn't know who was watching. They didn't know who they could trust. But they knew they had found something real, something that could change everything. Daniel felt nervous but focused. He had worked with numbers all his life, but now those numbers had faces and risks. Sophie felt afraid but determined. She had translated words for years, but now those words had meaning and danger. They were not just solving a puzzle. They were walking into a storm. The hidden code was not just in the papers. It was in the silence, the shadows, and the choices people made. Daniel and Sophie had opened a door. Now they had to decide how far they were willing to go. The truth was close, but so was the danger. And once you see the code, you cannot unsee it. Chapter 4. The Trap. Daniel Hart and Sophie Lemaire continued their search for answers. They had studied the documents, listened to the cassette tape, and followed every clue they could find. One note in the papers mentioned a location near the edge of Zurich. It was an old warehouse, not far from the train tracks. The building looked abandoned, with broken windows and faded paint. But the note suggested it was still in use, at least for storage. They arrived early in the morning, dressed simply and carrying small bags. Daniel brought a camera and a notebook. Sophie carried a flashlight and gloves. They entered through a side door that was already open. Inside, the air was cold and dusty. The space was large, with metal shelves and wooden crates. Some boxes were sealed, others were open. They saw old computers, stacks of paper, and folders marked with strange symbols. Daniel took photos of everything that looked important. He opened one folder and found a list of names and bank codes. Sophie found a box filled with printed emails and shipping records. They worked quickly, copying what they could and writing down details. They didn't speak. They moved with quiet steps and focused minds. After an hour, they left the warehouse through the same door. They didn't see anyone, but they felt watched. That night, Daniel walked through the city to clear his mind. He noticed a man behind him, walking at the same pace. When Daniel stopped, the man stopped. When Daniel turned, the man turned. Daniel entered a crowded café and stayed there until the man disappeared. He returned to his hotel and locked the door. He checked the photos and notes again. He felt the pressure growing. Sophie returned to her apartment and found a note under her door. It was written in simple words: "Stop asking questions." There was no name, no signature. Just a warning. She sat down and read it again. Her hands were shaking. She knew they had been seen. She knew the danger was real. They met in secret the next day, in a quiet park near the river. They sat on a bench and spoke in low voices. Daniel told her about the man who followed him. Sophie showed him the note. They both agreed it was time to go to the police. They needed help. They needed protection. At the police station, they spoke to an officer who looked tired and distracted. He listened to their story but didn't ask many questions. Daniel showed him the tape. The officer played it, then stopped halfway. He looked at them and said nothing could be done without proof. He said the tape was not enough. He asked them to leave. Outside, Sophie felt angry and afraid. She told Daniel they couldn't trust anyone. The secrets were too big. The people involved were too strong. They had to find another way. Daniel agreed. They needed someone who could speak to the public. Someone who could share the truth. They remembered a journalist in Geneva who had written about corruption before. His articles had exposed hidden deals and secret networks. They decided to send the documents to him. They used a fake name and mailed everything in a plain envelope. They included the tape, the photos, and the notes. Then they waited. Days passed slowly. Daniel stayed in his hotel, checking the news and watching the streets. Sophie stayed home. reading old articles and thinking about what might happen. They didn't speak to anyone. They didn't go back to the warehouse. They waited in silence. They knew they had done the right thing. But they also knew the risk. The trap had been set, and they had walked into it. Now they had to hope someone else would open the door. Someone brave enough to tell the world. Someone strong enough to face the truth. Chapter 5. The Reveal. The days after sending the documents felt long and quiet. Daniel Hart stayed inside his hotel room, checking newspapers and watching television. He didn't go out unless necessary. He used a different name at the front desk and paid in cash. He didn't speak to anyone about the briefcase or the tape. He knew the risk was still there. Sophie Lemaire did the same. She stopped going to her office and told her manager she needed time away. She didn't explain why. She packed a small bag and moved to a different apartment across the city. She used a different name on the mailbox and avoided places she used to visit. Then, one morning, the article appeared. The journalist in Geneva had published a long report. It was printed in a respected newspaper and shared online. The title was simple but strong. It spoke about hidden systems, secret money, and international deals. The article described Project Helix as a tool used by companies to move money without being seen. It explained how the system worked, using offshore accounts, fake contracts, and silent transfers. It named several companies and locations. And it named Victor Stein. Victor Stein was described as the man behind the system. He was called a financial architect. The article said he had built the network over many years, using his connections in banking and trade. It said he had helped companies avoid taxes and hide profits. It didn't say how the journalist got the information. It didn't mention Daniel or Sophie. But the details came from the documents they had sent. The tape, the reports, the notes, they were all used to build the story. The news spread quickly. Other newspapers picked it up. Television channels talked about it. Experts gave interviews. Investigators started asking questions. Some companies denied everything. Others stayed silent. Victor Stein gave a short statement. He said the article was false. He said he had done nothing wrong. But the pressure grew. People wanted answers. Governments wanted proof. The system was no longer hidden. Daniel read the article 3 times. He felt relief. The truth was out. The secrets were no longer locked in a briefcase. But he also felt fear. He knew the people behind Project Helix were powerful. They had money, lawyers, and influence. He didn't know what they would do next. He packed his things and booked a flight to New York. He used a different name and avoided public places. He didn't tell anyone where he was going. Sophie read the article in her small apartment. She felt the same mix of emotions. She had helped reveal something important. But she had also stepped into danger. She quit her job at the legal firm. She didn't want to be part of that world anymore. She started looking for work in a different field. Something quiet, something safe. She didn't speak to her old coworkers. She didn't answer calls from unknown numbers. Daniel and Sophie stayed in contact, but only through letters. They didn't use phones or email. They wrote by hand and used fake names on the envelopes. The letters were short but honest. They talked about the article, the reactions, and their new lives. They didn't talk about the briefcases anymore. That part of the story was finished. But the memory stayed with them. They had done the right thing. They had chosen truth over silence. But they had also learned how dangerous truth could be. They had seen how deep secrets could go. How quiet deals could shape the world. They had learned that courage was not loud. It was careful, patient, and sometimes lonely. The article changed many things. Investigations continued. Some companies were fined. Some people lost their jobs. But not everyone was punished. Some names were never revealed. Some doors stayed closed. Daniel and Sophie didn't try to open them. They had done their part. Now they had to protect themselves. They lived far apart, but they shared something strong. A moment of choice. A moment of risk. A moment that showed them who they really were. The reveal had happened. The world had seen the truth, and they had helped make it possible. Chapter 6. The Price of Truth. Months passed slowly. The world moved forward, but for Daniel Hart and Sophie Lemaire, time felt different. They followed the news from a distance. They read articles, watched reports, and listened to quiet updates. Victor Stein was finally arrested. It happened in a quiet way, without cameras or crowds. He was taken from his office in Geneva and questioned for hours. Several companies connected to him were fined. Some were closed. The system called Project Helix was shut down. But not everything was clear. Not everyone was punished. Some names were never printed. Some people simply disappeared. Daniel and Sophie knew they had touched something deep. They had seen how secrets moved through quiet hands and silent deals. They had learned how power worked behind closed doors. They had learned that truth has a price. It was not just about risk. It was about what you lose when you choose to speak. It was about the silence that follows, and the distance that grows between you and the life you had before. Sophie moved to a small town in the south of France. It was quiet, with old buildings and narrow streets. She found work as a teacher in a local school. She taught languages to children and helped them write simple stories. She didn't talk about Zurich. She didn't mention the briefcase or the tape. She lived simply, walked to work, and spent weekends reading in the park. She felt safe, but she also felt change. She had seen something that most people never see. She had carried a secret that didn't belong to her. And she had chosen to share it. Daniel returned to the United States. He didn't go back to his old job. He started writing about ethics in business. He gave lectures at universities and spoke to young professionals. He talked about honesty, responsibility, and the danger of silence. But he never spoke about Zurich. He never mentioned Sophie or the briefcase. He kept that part of his life in a quiet place. He knew it was real. He knew it mattered, but he also knew it was finished. They stayed in contact, but only through letters. They didn't use phones or email. They wrote by hand, slowly and carefully. The letters were short, sometimes only a few lines. They talked about books, places, and thoughts. They didn't talk about the past. But every word carried the memory. Every sentence was shaped by what they had lived through. Daniel sometimes walked through the streets of New York and looked at the tall buildings. He thought about how many secrets were hidden behind those windows. He thought about how many deals were made in silence. Sophie sometimes sat by the river in her town and watched the water move. She thought about the tape, the documents, and the moment she chose to act. They both knew they had made a difference. But they also knew they had paid a price. The world didn't change overnight. Corruption didn't disappear. But something had shifted. A door had opened. A system had been exposed. And behind that door, other people began to ask questions. Other voices began to speak. Daniel and Sophie didn't lead a movement. They didn't become famous. But they had done something important. They had shown that even a mistake can become a choice. And that choice can become a step toward truth. They carried the memory of the briefcases. Not as a burden, but as a reminder. A reminder that courage is not loud. It is quiet, careful, and often lonely. A reminder that the world is full of hidden deals. But sometimes, one small act can open a door. And behind that door, change begins. Moral: some secrets are hidden for a reason. But when truth is buried too deep, it begins to rot. Daniel and Sophie didn't plan to become heroes. They made a mistake, but they chose to act. They learned that courage is not loud. It is quiet, careful, and often lonely. The world is full of hidden deals. But sometimes, one small act can open a door, and behind that door, change begins. Thank you for your attention. If you like the story, please like and subscribe. It motivates us to make new videos and helps us promote the channel. Thank you.